Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss a new report on funding for gender ideology in the European Union, the rollout of a new progressive agenda focused around abundance, and 5 years from the COVID-19 pandemic, joined by Ashley Frawley and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So our very own Ashley Frawley is the author of a report for MCC Brussels, for which she's a fellow, on the EU's funding of NGOs that promote various transgender projects. Ashley, I understand you've gotten a bit of hot water over this with various people. They're protesting you or something. What's the underlying story and what's the response been to this report you're working on?
Right. So this report, which I've titled Mission Creeps, how EU funding and activist NGOs captured the gender agenda. So a pre-release has come out of the report. It'll be fully released in the next couple of days. But we had an event on Monday in Brussels with a few other sort of feminist speakers that I'll talk about in a moment. But and then the next day we spoke in Parliament. And when we spoke in Parliament, all of these protesters had come. And they were all lined up along the walls, sort of like trying to shame everybody going in. And there was this wonderful woman who came called Lydia something. I hadn't properly met her before, but she put a video of it on Twitter. And it's so funny because they were all covering their faces with signs, with like rainbow signs and like trans flag signs. And she says, are you ashamed? Like, are you ashamed to be standing here? Why aren't you showing your face? And so they put the signs down and she's like, you should be ashamed. It was she just went up to each and every one of them just so courageously. And she's like, you should be ashamed. You are threatening women's rights. Men cannot be lesbians. She goes like weakly, some men are. It was hilarious. Like not a single independent thought was held between any one of these protesters. They're all just saying the exact same kinds of slogans. Now, I feel bad kind of being too mean to these people because I assume that part of what they're doing is, misplaced kindness, that they think that they're being nice. And actually, that was one of the points that I made in the session that we had in EU Parliament, which was that our female sort of socialization, which we're supposed to be nice, is used against us. And it's women who are vilified for speaking out. And it's women mainly who are speaking out. But because you get punished twice. You're first punished for not adhering to the religion. And then you're punished again. So you're doubly deviant because you are breaking the unspoken norm that as a woman, you're supposed to be nice. You're supposed to be accommodating. That your discomfort matters less than a man's feelings, right? You should subordinate your own discomfort to a man's feelings. And so this is what happened. So we had we had some events caused a little bit of an uproar in Brussels, and now the report is doing the rounds. Has had some reportage, a range of outlets, actually. It has been mainly the right that has given attention to this because, as I've explained many times, the left and the right now have just become, well, you're left wing if you pretend to be nice, and you're right wing if you're a little rough around the edges. That's the extent of our political spectrum. So the left is like, ooh, this is framed as something that's about nice people, so I'm on that side. So the only people who are who've been giving this an airing usually are the right wing. But I've actually noticed a lot of interesting kind of coverage. So the speakers that we had at this at the event that we had on Monday were Stella O'Malley, who's a psychotherapist, author of a book called When Kids Say They're Trans, a parent, but also I think the founder of GenSpect, which is an organization that tries to take a non-medicalized view of gender dysphoria. She herself had gone through gender dysphoria before it had a name, or before it was sort of widely, became such a cultural phenomenon. It was something that she had gone through, but grew out of. I mean, and like profoundly had gone through, like wanted to live as a boy, basically lived as a boy, and was horrified as an adult when she saw this happening, because she thought that definitely would have been me. And then Faika El-Nagashi, who she is an incredibly courageous woman. She's a lesbian, a former MP from Austria, Green Party, left winger. She was the head of these organizations. She was the head of ILGA Europe, which is like the mermaids of Europe. Yeah, I'm not sure if you're familiar with mermaids, but it was like the big trans org.
Mermaids, is a UK pro-trans lobby, but maybe it's been shut down now or something. Is that right?
I'm not sure. They
Okay.
disappeared from the public eye with their tail between their legs some time ago, when there were these awful sort of like revelations about what they were doing and the people that were on their board. It's pretty horrible. But anyway, she was the head of like an organization called ELC, which is now EL*C. Guess what the L stands for? Lesbian. Guess why there's an asterisk? Because lesbians can be men too. So lesbian asterisk, don't worry. We're the good people. You can still give us your funding. Lesbian, wink, wink. Men can be lesbians too. So they actually changed their name, and she just like peaked, and she was like, no. And what incredible intellectual honesty that takes, right? That she realized something's going wrong, and she turned. And can you imagine, like, your whole life, she had grown up in this movement, and all her friends are in this movement, and she turned her back on them and started to say, this is wrong. And she campaigns for truth and for lesbians and for women's rights. I was just absolutely taken with her.
Now, one thing you're doing with this project, the report you've written, Ashley, you're drawing attention to funding of governmental, in the EU's case, it's a kind of paragovernmental, but it, has, elected representatives. It's drawing money from taxpayers in some way through some mechanism I, as an American, don't really understand. And then it's diverting that money or sending that money to NGOs. And that's understood by the people who are doing it to be a legitimate use of public funds, to be in the public interest. But I think there actually isn't a great understanding among a lot of voters about how or why money is going to various NGOs, and to what extent those NGOs are carrying on kind of quasi-governmental functions of, providing social services or defining a sort of public orthodoxy. And obviously in the US, Doge, Elon Musk, there's been a lot of attention drawn to this, and it seems that attention's also being drawn to it in the EU, in part through your work. So what's been the response to that? Are people aware that this is happening, or are they surprised by it? What's the level of awareness?
So for me, because this is the area that I work in, I do social problems, sociology of social problems and social policy. This is like, when I started writing this report, I was just putting these figures in, like, oh, there's so much money they're getting. It's a lot of money. I was like, because I'm like, this is what they do. This is called sock puppeting. I'm giving it all of its terminology. And then I bring my findings to, my colleagues, and they were shocked, absolutely shocked. I talked to other people. They were shocked. And I said, why are you shocked? So then I realized I had to rewrite the report to put these figures at the headlines, because, and the EU responded today. They said, oh, this is all transparent. Yeah, you can find most of this publicly. Not all of it. Some of it we've had to make requests to get. But you can find these figures. You can go look them up yourself. I've put my methodology in the report. You can go look it up, add it up all yourself. It's all transparent. But it also isn't. And that's the thing. That's why people were really shocked. So just to give you the headline figures here. So there's I calculate 221 million euros going to NGOs promoting gender ideology, 40.5 million going to the most radical transgender advocacy groups. So these are groups that just promote like this idea of born in the wrong body and gender transition at any age, really see parental rights as a problem. And 65 million was going to just one organization, ILGA World, which pushes this stuff worldwide. And they've had a huge impact in places like South Africa. And you just wonder, like, why are you pushing trans ideology in Africa? It's crazy. So it's a huge amount of money. But why didn't people know what was going on? Because they were purposely hiding, using, for instance, women's rights as a shield. They're still doing this now. So a lot of these groups, they appear to be women's groups. And you have to like dig deeper to understand how they define women as a series of gender roles. And that's how we define as well these sort of radical gender NGOs, is that they have this understanding of sex that becomes more and more divorced from biology. And that so that it just becomes a social construct, and then the social construct of gender becomes privileged above sex. And so they were, on the outside, what was the agenda? Gender equality. Okay, I can get on board with that. Sure, of course. Or they piggybacked on gay rights. So a lot of these policies were about gay marriage, and people were like, "Yeah, I'm in favor of that." And hidden within the policy, in the background, was gender self ID. And so it got onto the agenda without anyone knowing, and it got into law. And that is really the key thing, because once something is in law, it's very difficult to row it back. And the activists knew that. And that's why they went straight for the law and explicitly said, do not let the public know. And in fact, in 2024, before the European elections, ILGA Europe asked would-be MEPs, prospective MEPs, to sign a pledge saying that they would keep their activities secret. They asked MEPs to keep their campaigning or whatever they were doing in favor of the trans agenda, to keep it secret from the public, and over 1,000 would-be MEPs signed. So they have explicitly tried to keep it secret. So although I knew that they were getting a ton of funding, and that's just kind of what these NGOs do, what was really shocking was that most people did not realize what these organizations had become. They thought it was about gay rights and women's rights, and they're still doing it now. They're calling us, anybody who's against it, anti-gender. What do you understand by anti-gender? Anti-women, because gender used to be a shorthand for women. So now you're a weird backward person who hates women. No, I love women. I am one. I just don't think men can be women. Okay, that's once was not so crazy, but yeah. So that they call you sort of anti-gender. So that was the really surprising thing about the report. That I was shocked that people found it shocking, but I'm glad that we have some numbers to it that can kind of get some attention to what's really been going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, one book that I think about whenever I hear about the process you're describing, which is a process of women's rights actually coming to mean something broader, and that broader thing coming into conflict with a narrower definition of women's rights, or a classic definition of women's rights, perhaps, which is that it's about advancing the rights of biological, human biological females, right?
Imagine that.
There's a book called The Transformation of Title IX by Professor Shep Melnick, and he talks there about how Title IX, this law that is written to, just say women should have equal opportunities in education, that the same ones that men enjoy, has come to be interpreted to support transgender rights, and part of, and that what his book does is it really shows how the interpretation of Title IX in the U.S. as something that supports transgender rights is actually a logical extension of the way that Title IX was understood before transgender rights came on the scene. This isn't his argument explicitly. I don't want to. I'm not trying to put words in his mouth, but these are the thoughts I came away from his book with. And in his account, he shows how people who interpreted the laws, judges, administrators, came to understand it really as a mandate to avoid any kind of sex discrimination, and also anything that would seem to uphold sex stereotypes. And so it was really came to be read as a broader mandate against, barring anyone from any educational opportunity or athletic team, and anything that might seem exclusionary or seem to support a very definite idea of what a gender is. That kind of came to be the understanding, and you see this long before biological males changing in girls' locker rooms came on the scene, just in terms of what kinds of sporting events Title IX supported. So, something like a competitive cheer, very intense athletic event. One reason it's not a recognized collegiate sport in the U.S. is that some feminist scholars regard it as uh, not a proper event because it's tied to feminine ideas too closely. It seems to do too much to reinforce a traditional notion of what it means to be a woman. So
Unless it was a man doing it, then they'd be like, oh, never
right,
mind.
it might change. I mean, with competitive cheer,
In the
there's
skirts.
a more complex story, and the other reason it's not an NCAA recognized sport is that it's basically controlled by one man with a huge company, and he doesn't want to be under any other kind of outside supervision. So, it's always dangerous to assume, oh well, this bad thing's occurring just because of the crazy activists. There's usually a
Mm.
capitalist hiding back there too,
Yeah, yeah.
also playing a role in it. But competitive cheer is seen as reinforcing a certain idea of womanhood, and so that's to be derogated. Whereas something like 5-on-5 women's basketball is understood as breaking down notions of what femininity is, because men play this sport and women can do it too, and so one is bad and one is good, and that kind of logic, which was already operative in our legal regime, really, for clear reasons, came down on the side of the inclusion of biological men in women's sports. And you know, Trump, now that he's in office, is insisting on a different idea of Title IX, which is that it becomes incoherent when you don't tie the definition of womanhood to biological sex.
So just to come in on that point about, it's not just the crazy activists. I think that's a really important thing to mention here, is that actually I am not mad at the NGOs. The NGOs are just doing what NGOs do. They usually have some kind of check on, their an NGO's agenda is often a lot more radical than the general public is willing to accept. They know that. They temper themselves in public debate usually. But because they were shielded from public debate and had direct access to policymakers, legal frameworks, they were like, the EU was even giving funding for strategic litigation so that they could sort of cascade down their definitions of gender into all these different member states. They were given money for that. So, but that's just, they were in a great position. They were like, sweet, they're not going to say no. Why? That's the big question. Why were all the checks removed? Why was everybody jumping on the bandwagon for this? And there are obviously lots of different analyses and lots of different reasons, and there are no monocausal explanations. But I think we need to ask why this sort of breaking down of gender roles is so serviceable to capitalism, to our economy, to global governance. And I have a few answers for that, but it might take me a while to explain. But I've said this sort of in a few different articles for Compact. It's sort of part of my broader, the way that I sort of think about these things. But I think part of it is, the more obvious thing is part of the reason why they think, the EU's been pursuing economic growth through these crappy jobs that they're trying to push everybody into the service industry. And women will tend to do these kinds of jobs, 2 part-time jobs, 3 part-time jobs, because I got kids. And when they're looking at the stats and they see women out of work or not in the workplace, they're like, oh no, we need to push these women to the workplace. That's going to be an area for growth for us. And then when they see they're not in the workplace, they're like, oh, it's gender norms. We need to break down gender norms. So that's part of it. Another part of it is this, what I've been harping on about for a long time, is this destruction of the subject. The Enlightenment subject was implicitly a masculinized subject. This is something that a lot of the left, a lot of feminist scholars have criticized. And breaking down the masculine subject doesn't necessarily mean that you take the stereotypical. First of all, it doesn't even mean that that's like actually men. But also that it doesn't mean that you take the stereotypical feminine and be like, yeah, ladies, that's great. Be emotional, be close to nature, be health conscious, be body conscious, be risk averse. That's great. Be passive. Why? Because men ask for more money. Men are confident. Men are not the ideal worker. A woman will stay up all night to get it right. A man won't do that. I know. I watch. I watch them clock out at 5 p.m. I'm still there. I'm doing their work. I know. Yeah, and it's terrible. It makes us easily exploited. And the
A quick
powers that be are
window
like,
into
that's
the
great.
compact office culture there.
No,
As we're
no. As academia,
Jeff and I are
actually.
leaving the factory at 5 to go get drinks down at the Irish pub,
Yeah.
and Ashley's still slaving away.
No, I actually had a colleague steal my work, like outright, completely, just completely steal my work. Yeah, I'm still sour about it. I gotta say, none of you, no, present company completely excluded.
Yet, we haven't done it yet.
Yeah. But anyway, so that is a more pliant subject. That is a more desirable subject. That is the better subject of capitalism. We don't want these men. We don't want these men who believe in themselves, who have illusions of their own autonomy. We want a heteronymous subject. We want a woman who looks for the checklists and loves the bureaucracy and will tell us all about her emotions because you want to reveal everything and then put them on the acceptable script. Oh, that's a bad emotion. Here's a good one. You can have this one. And women will do that kind of stuff. And I don't mean that like biologically. I mean like all those nasty aspects of our socialization that we've been fighting against. Now that's reified and we're like, oh, that's great. So I think that's a huge part of what ultimately underlies this agenda.
Gender was one of the big themes in the 2024 campaign. Trump's most famous and seemingly most effective ad had the line, Kamala Harris is for they, them, Donald Trump is for you. In the wake of the Democrats' electoral loss, there's been a lot of discussion of where the party should go, and one big proposal is now being promoted in the form of a new book by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, writers for the New York Times and the Atlantic, respectively. And their book is called Abundance. Jeff, you've been reading the book. I haven't been, but I'm broadly familiar with the concept. Can you tell us a bit about what this abundance agenda is and why they think it is the road back to victory for the Democratic Party?
Well, there's, I suppose, a sort of more narrow version of that, and then a broader version. The more narrow version relates to various things I've read in recent weeks about the loss of population from the major Democratic states, notably California, New York, Illinois, Massachusetts, and what's going on here? Well, basically, people are moving to places where housing is more affordable. And this is an ongoing phenomenon, but it's only really since this most recent election that I think people have been sounding the alarm bells very widely about this as an immediate threat to the Democrats' electoral prospects. And I've seen people pointing out that, if this trend continues, the result will be a sort of net shift of electoral votes as well as House of Representatives seats to the Republican-dominated states, Texas, Florida, etc. And the result will be that the Democrats will have an even steeper climb to be able to compete in future elections. And so there is kind of just Klein and Thompson, both sort of Democratic-aligned policy analysts, are making an argument that I think is hitting a nerve in part because nobody can really deny that there's this exodus out of Democratic-run states. People are starting to see that this could actually mean it's just going to be even harder for Democrats to win elections now that the idea that they're going to turn Texas blue just on the basis of it becoming less white is no longer on the cards. As was made clear this past election. What we may see is the opposite, right? That California, did have a shift to the Republicans, and in any case, it will matter less if it just has fewer electoral votes. So, there's a very kind of immediate existential question for the Democratic coalition here, which is that it's created these cities, metro areas, states that are great generators of wealth, productivity, innovation, and yet its policies have perversely made it very hard for particularly middle-class people to live and build, lives and families and so on in these areas. And so this means they may just be moving to other states, which will have sort of immediate electoral ramifications for the Democrats. So, there's a version of this argument which is really just a kind of YIMBY case for, building more in like California so that we're not continuing to bleed population to red states. And, this is, I think, is kind of the shorter term, narrower, and again, very kind of existential driver of this argument. And at the same time, I think there is kind of a broader thing, a thing that's animating it, which is a lack of a clear vision from the Democratic side of the political spectrum of like what the future should look like, right? Of a positive vision of the future. It would seem that in the Obama era, when both Klein and Thompson sort of came up as pundits, or actually really earlier. I mean, Klein was a notable blogosphere figure in the Bush era who I remember reading. I mean, we're roughly the same age, I think. So I remember reading him when he was like a wunderkind, and I was, a recent college graduate or whatever. But, he's followed and tracked the fortunes of the Democratic Party for, his whole career. And, I think as he sees it, the sort of last moment that the Democrats really were offering a sort of robust, positive vision of the future would be the Obama era. But that, for various reasons, simply didn't pan out. It seemed to be, in some ways, it was sort of this idea of a post-racial America that then got derailed by the increased racial tensions of the 2010s. And then also by the fact more recently that it's become evident that a lot of working class non-white voters aren't really buying into the idea that the Democrats are the party that represents their sort of version of the future in America. And so, Trump is obviously, his campaign has been driven from the very beginning by this Make America Great idea. He's offered, a sort of vision of building, of, selling himself as a builder, as a developer, as someone who's going to, and, if we go back to 2016, he was promising great things on infrastructure. And so, we have clearly a figure who's come to dominate politics in part because he has tried to offer a robust, if often, vague and sort of, somewhat shifty and directionless sense of I'm going to take you somewhere better than the current situation. And so there's a feeling that the Democrats have to do that. And then, the more immediate, I think, impetus of the book was seeing that the Biden administration did attempt to kind of respond to Trump's, promise of rebuilding America, of development, of reindustrialization. The Biden administration did sort of pick up on the promises of this agenda and attempt to implement something like it with some, significant investments in industrial policy, a continuation of the tariff agenda, and so on. And that, in many ways, really didn't pan out. I mean, electorally in 2024, but also it simply failed to actually produce the things that were promised. And so, one example of this is like the, that's often been brought up in recent months is like they sank billions of dollars into building electric car charging stations across the country, and some like ludicrously small number of them was actually built. And then, the other example that's central to the Klein and Thompson book does go back farther, which is the California high-speed rail debacle, right? There was, and this goes back to the 80s, and it then, is one of the things that Obama really sells heavily when he's the president, and then it simply just doesn't happen. It's this kind of bizarre, labyrinthine narrative in terms of how this project of attempting to just build a single high-speed rail line has basically poured billions of dollars down the toilet and failed to produce anything after roughly 20 years. And so, they're, I think, on one hand, trying to address the lack of a positive vision of the future, which, I think also relates to the idea that the Democratic coalition is more focused on trying to, repair the supposed crimes of the past through reparations, through various kinds of, restorative justice and so on, that the Democratic coalition has actually become very backward looking and is obsessed with these kinds of restitution of past injustices type issues. And then at the same time that it's often dominated by people who look very pessimistically at the future, right? And promise just a climate crisis, just 5 years down the road, depending on who you listen to, we're just all going to be kind of boiled alive. And so it becomes this kind of vision of the future that is very dark. And sometimes that will, be presented as an impetus to, undertake massive technological change. But then there's kind of this bizarre thing where it's like, if we don't do this now, then we're all going to be dead in 5 years. But then, the way that the party actually responds to that is like, okay, we're going to build all these electric vehicle charging stations all across the country. And then 5 years later, they aren't even built. So it's this kind of weird combination of, of a lack of a positive vision and an inability to execute even on the things that, supposedly the party is most committed to and thinks and, treats as kind of existential, life-threatening questions. And then, the final big element of the argument really has to do with, again, housing. And I think it's not just about the loss of population in these areas because of high housing costs, but it's also about the idea that these are areas that are, that represent the weakness of the Democratic coalition, right? It's there are areas that are friendly to the very wealthy, and then there are areas that can accommodate the very poor, right? The dependent poor, So in New York City, you can either be very wealthy and have your pick of the wide array of luxury housing available, or you can live in public housing, right? And so what's being hollowed out is the middle, which, ostensibly, if you're a political party, is precisely who you should want to be able to appeal to. And so, I think all these things are connected, but this is essentially the argument. So anyway, that's I haven't finished the book yet, but that's how I understand it thus far. So if you have further comments on what the limitations of this might be, I'd be curious to hear them.
Well, it's interesting because when you're talking about like these low horizon visions for the future, what struck me, that even then they have no fire lit under them to even execute. What struck me is like, for them, it's because life is already great. You can just tell where they are in the world. And it reminds me a little bit of Hillary Clinton's like response to MAGA, which was America's already great. But it's not. It was not for a huge number of people. It's kind of an obvious thing to say. But like the high-speed rail thing, boy, that gets on my nerves. And I know Americans are really attached to cars. And perhaps it doesn't bother them as much as it does me. But I always thought like high-speed rail connections across the world are just such a wonderful vision for the future, that it could be so easy and cheap, relatively cheap, and energy efficient to zoom from continent to continent. Like we could do that. We do have the technology to do that. The cost is extraordinary, obviously, but that's what you want states to do. That's like the one friggin' thing that's good about a state, is that it will step in when it's not profitable to do something, when it would take a really, really long time to earn back your profit on an enormous infrastructure project like that. And they just don't care because they've got their cars and their whatever, like they've got a selection of cars. But I never learned to drive, which is such an embarrassing thing. But I came from a very difficult family background. And I went to university when I was really young. And I remember I had to be completely self-directed. I didn't have anybody around. I didn't have anybody help me with anything. And I was not a very self-directed kid. And I remember to go take the driver's test, I had to spend $40 to get a taxi. It's on the outside of town, of course. And that was a huge amount of money and a really difficult thing for me to do. And I get there and it was like 1:05 or something. They're like, oh no, you have to be here by 1:00, or we have a bureaucratic thing that says you need 60 minutes to do this test. And I was like, well, it's not going to take me 60 minutes. And like, sorry, that's the rule. Just come back on Monday. And I was like, you don't understand. I won't come back. I'm not going to come back. It was such an incredible, difficult thing for me to get across town. And I love that I live in Europe now, because I literally never had that problem ever again. I don't miss the fact that I don't drive. I should drive. I'm going to learn. I am learning in Greek at the moment. But it doesn't bother me because we have, good infrastructure in a lot of European cities. It's obviously a different story once you move out of the cities. But I mean, I've been able to get all across Europe, wherever, just using trains and stuff. It's crazy. But for them, they don't. What do they care? They don't know what that's like. That woman, that freaking bureaucrat, had no idea. She's just come back on Monday. I was like, you don't understand. It still makes me choke up thinking about it. Like, for her, it was no big deal. I was like, that was my grocery money. I will never do this again. Like, I'll never have that money again. Like, I still feel the loss of that $40. Anyways, so they live in this kind of world where they can imagine that the real problem isn't to reform the structure of society, but for them, the real problem is reforming the subjectivity of the poor. And that has been their major, and the working classes, that has been their major outlook, that they can't even imagine why the working class would want a better life, right? What really matters is that they have the wrong ideas in their head. And if we could just fix them. And so, like, they want too much, they desire too much. Their desires must be dampened down. Of course, it's the last thing that they want, is to give them a vision of the future. They're going to start getting uppity. They're going to start thinking that they deserve it. These are the ruling classes we're talking about.
I'm well qualified to speak on the abundance agenda and the broader YIMBY or yes in my backyard pro-building, pro-density notions behind it, because I live in Manhattan in a tall brick tower and when I look out the window here, I see a power plant. So I live in a world that is much like the one that they would like to help build. And there's some real problems with this world as it currently exists. And I'm not going to say anything that surprises any listener, but it just has to be stressed because progressive governance has failed. New York is not safe or orderly enough. You can look at things like murder rates, the amount of kind of stabbings, all of this. That's very important, and those numbers are higher than they should be, and higher than they've been. Since they were lower when I first moved to the city during the Bloomberg rule or reign, who's practically the king of New York. But there's also this issue of disorder, and that really bothers people. I have 4 children aged 6 and under. I live in New York. I'm not a single middle-aged guy. I'm not a kind of young professional who just is happy to cross the street when he sees something disorderly. When you're pushing a stroller down the sidewalk with multiple children in it, and there's some man acting erratically coming down the sidewalk towards you, which often happens, and I've never been harmed by any of these men, but it's not something that you welcome as a parent. It's not a risk you want to suffer, and it's really not an option to not worry about this. You have a duty to your children to find the safest and most orderly place for them that you possibly can. Too many people in the U.S. In New York don't have that privilege. They're not really able to have these nice, safe environments, which you get on Fifth Avenue, which you get on the Upper East Side. But where I live in New York, it's a little more chaotic. So progressives really need to address that governance failure, and they show no sign of doing so. New York spends a huge amount of money on homeless services, but because they take a non-coercive approach, it's totally ineffectual. And education is just a gigantic problem in these blue cities. I mean, this whole pro-abundance thing, this whole vision that they have for building housing for kind of middle-class people, the people who aspire to move to the suburbs, want to move to somewhere around Phoenix right now. I mean, you've got to give them higher quality education than you now are in these blue districts. And part of that, frankly, is getting the woke stuff out. It's a distinct issue, but it's related. Families do not want to have their children presented with kind of unsettled ideas of gender. That's just not what they want when they have these young school-age children. So DeSantis was much attacked for his so-called "Don't Say Gay" law. I remember one writer I know, a conservative writer, saying it shouldn't be called "Don't Say Gay." It should be called "Wait Until 8," because under the laws of Florida, once they're 8 years old, you can begin telling them about this. So I also oppose DeSantis's "Don't Say Gay" law, but only because it's too liberal. It shouldn't be wait until 8. It should be wait until 18 or something, she claimed. But that's a measure that the Democratic Party was very, very foolish to organize against. So those are just some really basic issues that are huge problems with the abundance agenda. No one wants just to live in these high towers in these super dense areas when there isn't going to be the regular provision of law and order. And I would stress also the second part of that, order. To have a clean, safe, and reassuring feeling place where you feel comfortable having young children. New York is just really, really bad at that. So I'd stress that, and I'm sure that Klein and Thompson would tend to support such measures, but this is going to take some bullet biting. It's going to take disregarding very important members of the Democratic coalition who say certain forms of policing, certain kind of public ordinances have to be reinstated. Maybe certain social changes need to be revisited. Is it good to have the scent of marijuana, wafting down every sidewalk in New York? I for one don't think so. And it's not like the GOP is prepared to revisit that either. I remember during the campaign, Trump said, "Oh yeah, I promise, I vow, I will keep marijuana legal." Trump's sort of just whatever seems popular, he's behind pretty much. But
there's no deep philosophical thinking going on there.
But progressives are going to need to be willing to really turn against their activist base on some issues and actually push back on them. And I'm not sure that I see that fighting spirit, just speaking in a general way, from the Kleins and the Thompsons of the world. Maybe that's unjust, but I don't sense that. You've got to punch right. They've got to start drawing some lines and punch right. Yeah, sure, they should punch right. They're progressives. They've got to punch left. They've got to punch left too, though. Okay, and until they begin to do that, on some of these law and order and culture issues, I don't think that people should want to live in these kind of high density suburbs or whatever they're proposing.
Yeah, I was just gonna add a few more thoughts. There's sort of a class. I mean, I brought up the point that ultimately, I think that what this is about is the shrinking of the Democratic coalition, and particularly its inability to appeal to essentially the aspiring middle class, which I think is part of why it lost. They're speaking of Klein. I mean, he had an interview with the pollster David Shore the other day, and they drilled into a lot of data from 2024, including stuff that a lot of stuff that I had heard, but then stuff that I hadn't. That Trump, I believe, even won Haitian majority precincts in Florida, which is pretty remarkable. Or majority people of Haitian descent, and given all the brouhaha about Haitians in Ohio, this is pretty remarkable. Maybe even more so than the similar Puerto Rican thing. But there's a sense that what this means is, and particularly sort of recent areas that were in which there are large recent immigrant populations. One area that was covered quite a bit after the election was Corona, Queens, which, if anybody's been there, is it's really just the quintessential kind of New York immigrant neighborhood, or one of them, that whole stretch of Queens along the 7 train. And these areas, some of them really went majority. I mean, either saw a massive swing or majority for Trump. So these are connected to everything we've been talking about, including, I'd say, for those communities, a lot of it is connected to issues of security, public disorder, things like that. But also just to this larger question of, if you have the aspiration to become part of the American middle class, which party represents you? And so, I think the problem with, or perhaps the weakness of Klein and Thompson's proposals, in addition to what Matthew just laid out, which is, I suppose, one instance of this larger thing, is that, in effect, it will require a kind, that if the party is to some extent defending the interests of a certain subset of donors, but also of kind of, upper middle class, like suburban, college educated professionals, like those are the people who will be asked to essentially make sacrifices in order to realize this kind of agenda. I mean, I grew up partly in Westchester County, and there have been many. I mean, even going back to my childhood in the 80s, there were conflicts over affordable housing developments there, and those have continued to this day. It's never ceased to be an issue, and in some cases, it pits. As it did in the 80s when I was a kid, it sort of pitted, essentially, what are called sort of, northern white ethnic enclaves, of essentially sort of Irish Italians, Jews, and so on, against, most of whom had grown up in the Bronx and eventually moved up to, Yonkers, the next city up. And, that there was an attempt to, develop affordable housing as well as enforce federal housing integration in this area. And it created a huge political conflict. And, then there have also been, particularly more recently, conflicts over attempts to develop, affordable housing around the Metro North commuter train stations in some of these more affluent towns. I'm not sure if there has been one in Chappaqua, which is where, at least at some point, Bill and Hillary Clinton lived after the presidency. I'm not sure if they're still there. And, so there have been these conflicts. And not surprisingly, in general, the wealthier towns have been more successful at keeping these developments out than the, sort of working to middle class towns. And, that's indicative of the problem that this coalition faces, right? Which is that it's increasingly reliant on the Chappaqua of the world, both as reliable voters and as donors and so on. But it's unlikely those people are going to accept, big affordable housing developments near the commuter train station that they go to every day. And, the changes in the kind of demographic, or in the feel of the sort of small town suburban enclave that they've chosen, as well as the changes to the schools and all those kinds of things. So this is a long ongoing thing. And I think it becomes a particularly acute crisis in terms of the class composition of the party today. And I don't see this book really having an answer to that. It's just sort of trying to prevail on essentially sort of Democratic aligned elites to accept the attractiveness of this vision. But for many of them, it will actually involve some pretty unattractive things, right?
Okay, so let's get down to some bullet biting. And all right, you're offering this class-based objection to this and saying, it tends to dodge the elites. What if Montclair, New Jersey, which is famously home to a large proportion of the workforce of the New York Times, a lot of other writers, people at the Journal, other prestige magazines, should Ezra Klein just lead a campaign to build large housing developments, and affordable kind of for mixed income in Montclair? Should they just build it up high, and then at that point, whenever someone raises one of these objections of, well, you guys aren't willing to suffer it, they can say, what are you talking about? We have all of these housing complexes all over our town. That's
think
the way forward, right?
It is. Yeah, I think it's a very good idea.
Or maybe Trump should mandate it. Should Trump mandate affordably furthering fair housing by building large affordable housing projects in Montclair? Should the Republicans kind of steal this issue from the Dems and use it to kind of smite them?
It's a great idea. They should hire you as a strategist.
Okay, so Geoff, you'll write that up for us. Why YIMBYism for Montclair, and or maybe you can write that up and submit it to one of our leading national papers and see if they print it.
I have a good segue. But is this one of those places in your vision where you'd want to be locked down?
Yes, that's a great question, Ashley. And as you know, it's now 5 years since the onset of the pandemic. Really, one of the definitive events of our time. I'll say it came at a great time for me. I have almost nothing to complain about. About 2 weeks before the pandemic hit, my wife gave birth to our second son. We also had a 1-year-old at the time. And with a 1-year-old and a newborn, I wasn't going anywhere for the next year. I was going to be home every night. I was effectively locked down by biology. Okay, never mind the pandemic. So, I wasn't a young person wanting to play sports. I wasn't trying to, meet people, or I wasn't relying on an office culture to make connections and establish a foothold in a new profession. I was really at the perfect point in life for this, but for others, the effects were just cataclysmic. And you've seen that in all kinds of things, in literacy among people who were in school at that time. I think just well beyond the people who actually suffered and died from the disease, just loss
People
of human
getting thrown
connection
out of work.
of all kinds. Yes, people being fired for failing to comply, and it was quite a time. I'll just recount a bit of my own reaction beyond my sort of relief that I really had less to lose than almost anyone from the mass suspension of civil liberties and normal social life. I was initially a COVID hawk. I was quite concerned about it, and that's one reason I left the city very early, about a week or two before the great mass of people did, because I wanted to not contract the disease before I left and went into a more isolated place. But then, as we saw more data roll in, I became skeptical. I also became increasingly skeptical of the response, specifically of religious authorities. When the pandemic hit, I worked at the religious magazine First Things, and we were engaged in this. And what you saw just in the religious sphere was something really extraordinary. So in Catholic theology, I'm Catholic. The sacraments are these effective means of grace. You have an obligation to at least attend Mass every week. You may not receive the sacrament, but you're supposed to attend every week. If you're dying, you're supposed to receive the last rites. And that's the way in which grace is actually administered to you. And it can't be done over Zoom. It can't be just a nice thought. It has to be done in person with these proper means. Baptism has to occur. And I saw religious leaders just say, we are suspending the sacraments. So you had bishops saying, if you die, you will not receive the ministry of the church. You will be buried. No priest will visit you, nor will there be a Catholic funeral for you. If you're born, you won't be baptized. That's less severe, because you can put that off. All right. We had one church turn us away, just refused to baptize our child because of the pandemic. We found another. It's fine. But if you're dying, it's a little harder. You can't really wait around a few months to get last rites. And this wasn't, it's tempting to look back and say, well, this is just a conspiracy of the elites. Fauci did this and it was just some bad bishops. No, I mean, there was massive support for this among the professional classes. The chattering classes were absolutely fanatical. So I wrote an article for my then employer, First Things, called "Church as a Non-Essential Service," and it was a very moderate article. I pointed out the fact that my then employer, R.R. Reno, had been objecting in a very strong way to the church's refusal of sacraments. I also pointed out that Giorgio Agamben, the Italian philosopher, had highlighted this and denounced it very sharply. And I said, well, what if we were just to let people into the church, but we said, you need to mask, you need to socially distance, you need to use hand sanitizer. So I was never a kind of, inoculate yourself to the virus by contracting it and go everywhere en masse. I was taking this very kind of milquetoast position. I was denounced by hundreds of people for this article. And very notably, I was denounced by people who pride themselves on being defenders of liberalism and of civil liberties. The very prominent people in Catholic life, and their right to care about our civil liberties and the right to find value in our order, in our political order, including in elements of it that are described as liberal. But they showed no appreciation of the fact that civil liberties were being massively suspended at the time. Many of them had opposed Trump and denounced him because they feared that he would become a dictator and would violate American civil liberties. That really more or less happened in 2020. That was the moment when there was just a mass suspension of civil liberties. And one reason no one really wants to talk about it is that so many people were complicit. Yeah. So every single denunciation of Trump's fascism, of Trump's dictatorial stuff, I've never seen one discuss what happened during the pandemic, which is actually where you would want to hang the case, because that's when you were not allowed to join in protest groups. You already had the disinformation complex humming. People were being censored. And yes, Trump was clearly somewhat reluctant to embrace elements of this, but he did. So I think he's answerable for it. But the problem is that all the people who might find benefit now in criticizing him were actually more enthusiastic than he was. So they're not going to do so. You also saw these people who are great fans of civility just denouncing as unhuman anyone who objected to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I have to say, it was an unbelievably dark time for me. Though I had little to lose myself, I was part of that professional class that had relatively little to use, and as the father of a newborn, I had almost nothing to lose. But
I'd like to hear your wife's opinion on this.
But I had a real loss of faith in public institutions, and not just in our political institutions, as I saw them, suppress things like Jews joining together to mourn their dead in public, while cheering on BLM protests and saying, "Well, those are in the interest of public health," but mourning the dead is not. So that just really endangered my faith in the political sphere. But in the ecclesial sphere, it really deprived me of any residual Catholic triumphalism I had as someone who had converted to the Catholic Church, with some enthusiasm, and not only believed in Catholic doctrine, but thought that there was something, kind of bonny and gay about being Catholic and in this fine institution. It was profoundly alienating and depressing, and there was, I think, a loss of moral authority that the church has, well, probably for a lot of people, failed to recover.
As people listening to this may know, I've written extensively about COVID. I have, way too much to say about it. But I will point people to a article I recently published on a different website, that of the Chronicle of Higher Education, that Matthew is focused on the religious institutions. This piece was focused on academic institutions. And it was a review of a book by Stephen Macedo and Francis Lee, professors at Princeton, who contributed a piece to Compact last year. And it's a very important book called In COVID's Wake. I recommend everybody read it. And I mean, it's not necessarily entirely focused on, but it is written by two prominent academic political scientists who both teach at Princeton, and it is definitely in significant part directed at certainly the professional class, as Matthew said, but also the academic class. And so that was why I wanted to write about it for the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is sort of the daily read of American academics, because I think it's really important that they hear the message. And that's simply that, if you just look at various things like the quality of evidence on which certain decisions were made, as well as on which certain consensuses were developed and enforced, I mean, it's really just, laughably poor, just kind of ludicrously poor. And yet, there's been very little before, particularly before this book, there's been very little sort of high level attempts to review what happened during those years. And the reasons for that are pretty clear, that the sort of groupthink that came to dominate has never really gone away. And to the extent that people are aware that that was happening at the time, they're understandably quite embarrassed about it, and therefore don't really want to revisit and relitigate this whole affair, because it's really actually extremely discrediting. And, just to go through like the very basic point about, where did this whole idea come from of, shutting down all of society? Well, it came from an authoritarian state, which did exactly that after having attempted to cover up and sort of obfuscate the virus for some time. It then reversed course and enacted this citywide, forcible lockdown. And, prior to that, this idea had been considered, interestingly. There had been a few kind of more or less dissenting public health sort of scholars and officials who had argued that something like this might be a good idea. And notably, they were both their names escape me, but there were two prominent figures who made this case for doing lockdowns before 2020. One of them is named Meacher, I believe, and I can't remember the other one's name. But in any case, they were both employed during the Bush administration, right? And this whole ideology was very much tied to the sort of war on terror sensibility that had taken hold at that time, right? This whole kind of state of emergency, way of thinking about politics that, when I was a graduate student, all the left academics were obsessively critiquing. But then when it actually came about in 2020, they all decided it was good and approved of it. But my point here is this idea had been discussed and debated, and generally the consensus in the public health community was that it was a very bad idea, right? It probably wouldn't work, particularly once community spread had reached certain levels, and it was also deeply immoral and very troubling. And as Macedo and Lee document in this book, you can even find open letters signed by people who later became prominent advocates of lockdown, in which in March 2020, they said, we really shouldn't just do this thing that China is doing. Like, it's really dangerous. We need to be careful about, adopting this approach. But then basically once it was done, and the reason it was done was partly because of the kind of shock and awe of the moment, and the kind of collective panic that took hold, and the fact that basically the World Health Organization sent a group of people to study what had happened in Wuhan, and they came to some extremely bizarre and poorly justified conclusions, which essentially suggests, as other evidence does, that the WHO it relies heavily on funding from the Chinese government. It was essentially doing kind of propaganda for the Chinese government. So that was one reason. And then the other was the models of Neil Ferguson at Imperial College London, who had a long record of heavily exaggerating the threats of various pandemics and coming up with apocalyptic numbers in his models that were pretty much never borne out. And yet, his models were suddenly treated as sacred writ by world leaders, including Donald Trump. And, that either we had to take the Wuhan approach or, full on kind of Black Plague level catastrophe awaited us. And so there really was just this bizarre moment in which people really suspended their critical faculties and accepted extremely weak and poor forms of evidence, and including people who, and this was, I suppose informed a lot of my response to it from the beginning, was that I, first went to graduate school in the kind of later years of the Bush administration, the war on terror. And so we were all talking about states of exception and the dangers posed by them. We were all talking about Giorgio Agamben and reading his books. And then suddenly he became a pariah early on, basically for kind of hammering away at the same argument he'd been making.
One of his translators and devotees, Adam Kotsko,
yes,
wrote an article in Slate that was this sort of pained, pseudo-pained renunciation of his intellectual mentor. And that's a very shameful act of intellectual parricide. And there was a lot of shameful behavior of that type during the pandemic.
Indeed. I don't want to sort of go on for too long, but I will just say I had a 22-month-old and a 3.5-year-old at the start of the pandemic. So when you were saying, Matthew, you had nothing to lose, I felt my rage build inside me. I was thinking,
let it out. Let it out.
How did your wife feel about that situation? I'm not sure. You're like, it was great. I was like one of the babies. No, I'm sure that you're great. But I was like, oh, it was horrible. But I actually have a video. I should post this actually on the anniversary of the lockdown, which I think is the 23rd of March in the UK. It was so absurd. I actually took a video of it. I was trying to write, and I had my baby, my toddler, on my lap, and I had a board next to me, like a magnetic board, and she was standing up, grabbing all the things, and it's just raining down on my head. And there was like a big metal tray for markers, and it just comes down, it hits me in the head, and I just was like, and kept writing. Like I just kept going. And that was what it was like for me. But I wrote a column during that time. Well, I was writing all the time, as I do, but it wasn't very good because I was writing all this with a toddler on my lap. But I think the point that I tried to make in that column was a good one, which was you both talked about people being sort of complicit and how nobody wants to talk about it anymore because they were so on board with things. And it's weird because they won, right? The critics, we've been vindicated, but they won. When we think about like what were the big controversies, the big post-COVID controversies, it wasn't like, oh my God, we've all come out of this drunken stupor, we see the light of day now. It was like, oh, you broke lockdown. No, you broke lockdown. At least that's what it was in the UK. People are getting mad about the completely wrong things, which means that if we have another pandemic, I think the same thing's going to happen again. I think the same thing I'm not sure that we have learned anything, and nobody really wants to learn anything. And here's the thing. Why were people so complicit? And this is what I wrote in that piece, which was poorly written. But the point I was trying to make is that people wanted something to believe in. They wanted a common cause. They wanted, like, it was like a warlike idea. Especially in the UK, they were doing the keep calm and carry on thing. It was like that World War II spirit that they were trying to drum up in people, and people liked that. They wanted to be part of something. They wanted a common cause, and it was a good common cause, because in a war, you can see the other side. You can see the logic in the other side. There's victims and villains, and it's awkward. But with this kind of war, it was a virus. There was nothing good about it. And that made you so much worse, because you were, health was the last religious ethos. It is the last religious ethos. It's like risk avoidance is our new morality and ritual. And so it was like the perfect storm of things that people could get behind, because we don't have a shared morality anymore. And so people will say, well, it's for your health. It's for your health. So when people were questioning that, they were heretics. They were, not only were they heretical in questioning the one last value our society holds in common, which is health, they were also questioning that perfect moral crusade that was being constructed by the powers that be. I think that's what people wanted. People wanted something that they could get behind.
You say health is the last religious ethos. Uh, as already mentioned, I'm a believer. I'm a Catholic.
No, I
Um,
mean widely shared doesn't
yeah,
mean
well, no,
individuals are not.
but no, I want to, yeah, I just want to reinforce your point. I think that's what I saw during the pandemic, and I was talking about its shocking and revealing nature. Is that it revealed to me that within this church that claims to stand for a particular faith, that the real faith held by many
Yeah.
many people is just health.
Hmm.
And so one had to really revise downward one's idea of uh, to the extent to which this institution offered a real living and definite alternative to the reigning system of belief. So yeah, so striking at that time. And right now we're seeing in the U.S. We have our new Health and Human Services Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy, questions a lot of the scientific consensus in various ways that strike me as harmful. But it needs to be understood that this is to some extent a backlash against an establishment that has really done a lot to discredit itself. Done things um, that it never needed to do. Uh, I do want to say that one of the great successes of the pandemic in Sweden, where they didn't lock down, is the result of a very kind of uncompactish arrangement. Here at Compact, we sometimes talk about the importance of the political and democratic control and vague and technocracy, but they had a very independent scientific advisory body that was not subject to any kind of democratic control, very independent. And they just had a different model, made a different reading, and said, we're not locking down. And that independent technocracy was actually, in that case, really correct and effective. And it wasn't subject to this mass herd like pressure to suspend social life. So I think I just want to mention that because I've denounced some others who were inconsistent during that time. I wasn't don't know that I was inconsistent, but I think it's an example of something that went well, that cuts a bit against the general theory of politics that we advance here at Compact. So it's worth acknowledging that. I also want
Well,
to
I
say,
have an explanation for
go
that.
for it, go for it.
Although I haven't verified this, and it's been a long time, because I never wrote about it. But I had read at the time that part of the reason why Sweden went that direction is because their far right initially, very early on, seized upon the idea of radically locking down the borders as a xenophobic agenda, and actually. Some people that I know that are like sort of very working class and right wing initially, like old friends who are like frenemies, were like attacking me, that I was the reason why this virus was coming into our country because I'm one of these elite intellectuals that travels a lot in their minds. And then these people switched very quickly to being like anti-lockdown, but at first they were very pro. So I mean, it's obvious because it's very authoritarian, right? That it would be quite a right wing thing, but it got a left wing wash and was widely embraced. But yeah, that's part of the reason why Sweden, I have read, went in that direction, because it was their far right that initially had embraced authoritarian measures.
That's really interesting. I hadn't heard about that element of it. In conclusion, just want to mention a few people that I happen to know who I think performed very admirably during the pandemic. I mentioned, that I offered objections to the way it was being handled and was widely denounced as some kind of virus denier. But looking back, my only regret is that I was too milquetoast, and because I didn't really take a sufficiently sharp and strong stand, in my view. Though I did get tweeted hundreds of times, but people who took much stronger positions, I just want to mention, would be R. Reno, the editor of First Things, who was really the leading voice insisting that or spiritual values must be placed above temporal values, spiritual health above physical health. Giorgio Agamben, who Geoff mentioned as well, consistently applying his insights from the Bush era to this more recent crisis. And then two journalists, Helen Andrews and Peter Hitchens, both contributors to Compact, who took very strong and at the time very controversial stances against it. So I want to mention them along with you, Ashley and Geoff, and my real admiration for those who took a firmer stance than I did, because sometimes it isn't just about being right or sufficiently subtle. Sometimes you need a clear, strong voice offered against the wind. So thanks to all those who did. And thanks to you listeners. This week only, you can go to compactmag.com/anniversary-2025 and subscribe for a full year for just $20.